Maria Noesi, and I will be your host and moderator. We are very excited to have all of you with us today for our webinar, Doubling Down on School Suicide Prevention During COVID-19. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with Cognito, we're an organization that believes in the power of conversation and how conversations can have a positive impact on our social, emotional, and physical health. And we harness that by creating virtual training that are grounded on providing individuals like teachers, students, and staff with the opportunity to practice conversation skills around tough topics like suicide prevention in a private environment. So we are very excited to have our presenters today talk about this very, very important topic now more than ever. So before I turn it over to them, I'd like to start off with some housekeeping rules. Today's session is being recorded, so please don't worry about taking notes. We will send you a copy of the recording and the slides after the webinar. During the presentation, attendees are in listen-only mode. However, we have allotted time at the end for questions, and we want this to be an interactive discussion. So we encourage you to submit questions using the GoToWebinar interface. Next, in partnership with our presenters, we have created a few poll questions to help us better understand you, our audience, and also help frame today's discussion. So as the first poll question appears on your screen, I just want to invite you to tell us a little bit about yourself. The first question being, which of the following best describes your role? Are you an administrator, a school mental health professional, a nurse, teacher, or other? And for those of you who fall under the other category, feel free to use the chat or the question box to tell us a little bit about your background. So I'm going to leave the poll open for a few more seconds before sharing the results. So it looks like the majority of you are school mental health professionals. With the next in line being other, only 7% being administrators and 8% being nurses. So thank you all for joining us and for sharing. I'm going to go ahead and move to the next poll question, which is, does your school have a comprehensive suicide prevention plan? To the best of your knowledge. So go ahead and share with us, yes, no, or not sure. And given that a lot of you are mental health professionals, I can imagine that you will be have intimate knowledge of whether you have a comprehensive suicide prevention plan in your school. So I'm going to go ahead and share the results. So 59% said yes, not surprising. 20% said no, and 21% not sure. I'm going to go ahead and transition to the third question, which is, for those of you who have a comprehensive suicide prevention plan in place, do you understand how your suicide prevention plan works and can be enacted? So again, I'm going to give you a few seconds. And I'm going to go ahead and share the results with, again, beautiful 83% of you said yes. Only 17% said no, which is great. And the final question is, and I want to again invite everybody, this is a critical question, which is, especially now in the school year, have you provided support to a suicidal student, referred a suicidal student to support services? And again, I definitely want to invite you to share either via the chat or the question box to share any additional details that you feel comfortable sharing with the group. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and again share the results. 82% said yes. So this is a sobering statistic to see. I'm sure our presenters will not find it surprising. So I hope that the conversation that we have today can help as you navigate the rest of the academic school year in supporting those students who need the most help. So I want to go ahead and introduce our esteemed panelists. We are joined today by Dr. Scott Poland, who is the professor and co-director of the Suicide Violence Prevention Office at Nova Southeastern University. Dr. Poland is a licensed psychologist, an internationally recognized expert on youth suicide, self-injury, school violence, school safety, threat assessment, and school crisis. He has authored or co-authored 5 books and many chapters and articles on these subjects, including suicide in schools. He has also co-authored the Suicide Safer School Plan for the state of Texas and previously directed psychological services for a large Texas school system for 24 years. We are also joined by Richard Lieberman, who is a lecturer and youth suicide prevention expert. Rich is currently a lecturer in the Graduate School of Education at Loyola Marymount University. And from 1986 to 2011, he coordinated suicide prevention services for Los Angeles Unified School District. He has also co-authored numerous book chapters on suicide intervention in the schools, consulted nationally with districts experiencing suicide clusters, and served in the steering committee for the Suicide Prevention Resource Center, and contributed to both SAMHSA Preventing Suicide and SBRC AFSB After a Suicide School Toolkit. I want to welcome both of them. Thank you for your time, and I'll now turn it over to Scott to get us started. Scott, take it away.
Thank you very much, Maria. And thank all of you for tuning in today, as we want to give you very important information about suicide prevention. And it sounds like we're primarily speaking to mental health professionals, and we're so glad that you have a plan and that you've enacted that plan. We also recognize that dealing with a suicidal student creates a lot of anxiety, and it's very important to seek out collaboration when you are engaging with suicidal young people, and so important that their parents are notified. Now, I suspect that some of you listening today are survivors of suicide. If you are, I lost my father when I was 25 to suicide. I'm a good example of somebody who never thought it could happen to me. But if you lost a loved one to suicide, have a pretty good idea of what you've gone through. And we believe strongly in prevention. Rich and I have been working together on this topic for nearly 3 decades and hope today to share some things that will be helpful to you. Now, we know the suicide rates have increased pretty dramatically, and that particularly dramatic increases for middle schoolers, nearly tripled in the last decade. It's nearly doubled for high school students. It is now the second leading cause of death for children in America over the age of 10. And schools play a key leadership role in partnering with local and state and national resources. We can prevent the mass majority of youth suicides. And Rich, could you talk about it through a cultural lens?
I will, Scott. Thanks. And before I get started, I just want to thank Cognito, working with Cognito again, and for the opportunity of working with Scott again today. We have I'm watching the numbers. We have a large national audience today, and I guess I know that I'm not the only one who has lost a loved one during this pandemic. So I just wanted to open and say, express my deepest sympathies to those if you have lost a loved one, a family member, a friend, a co-worker. Scott and I are really honored and privileged to talk with you today. If you made time out, we know that everybody's schedule is just absolutely packed, so we really appreciate the time we have with you today. As Scott was talking about, this problem was truly the most serious public health problem in America today. Youth suicide rates have increased steadily since 2007, a number of very complex reasons for that. Scott has looked at it through a developmental lens, comparing middle school kids with high school kids, and we can see how the suicide rate for middle school kids tripling in the last decade. But we also have to look through a cultural lens. And when we look through a cultural lens, first, we have seen, predominantly Black and brown communities disproportionately impacted by the COVID crisis. African-American youth in the last decade had shown the sharpest increase, while white males and Native Americans still have higher rates. The African-American rate has increased according to the African American Caucus, 73% in the last decade. Latinx, boys and girls lead all other ethnicities in the reporting of suicidal thoughts and suicidal behaviors, not yet translating to suicide completions as they trail other groups. Asian American kids are leading all other youth in the reporting of depression and anxiety symptoms. One of the ways that we look we get a pulse of risk factors in America is to look at the youth risk behavior surveillance studies that are done every 2 years. Survey of 50,000 students in America, and it gives us a pulse on risky behaviors. We don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but there are just a couple of observations I want to make. We pull out 5 of the questions. We pull out a depression question, and we pull out 4 suicide-related questions. And the numbers are astounding. They have been increasing also every year. But this year, 37% of youth in America, actually 45% here in California, answered yes to experiencing a prolonged sense of depression, which is 2 weeks or longer, over the past year that interrupted their daily functioning. Just think about that. 37% of kids are at diagnosable levels of depression. One other thing I noticed in the new stats for 2019 is that 9% of kids that were that participated reported making 1 or more suicide attempts in the past year. That we then follow up with our last question of, if you attempted suicide in the past year, did you get to help? Well, we found that of the 9% that responded, only 3% got to help. So how to break that down in America? For every 3 kids that attempt suicide, 1 gets to help, 2 get up and go to school the next day. Let's confront some myths. Take it, Scott.
You know, Rich, the most important issue here is that in America, we just don't talk about suicide. Too many people are afraid if we bring it up, somebody will think about it for the first time. And really, if somebody has thoughts of suicide and you give them the chance to talk about it, they get to unburden themselves. They get to realize, I'm not alone. I'm not the first person to feel this way. There is help available. And the bottom line is, as we're talking about middle schoolers and high schoolers, they tell each other things. But unfortunately, most adolescents, nobody has ever talked to them about how to get help for your suicidal friend. And sometimes adolescents in particular attach a permanence to this that is simply not there. We know that when individuals actually survive a suicide attempt, there's every likelihood that they will never attempt again. So we know no kid is suicidal 24/7. They're actually ambivalent about it. Yes, they're experiencing constriction and thinking and perceive that they have unendurable pain and can't see a way out. But when there's help, they realize there are alternatives. And they're almost always warning signs. Sometimes those are subtle. I remember a mom saying to me, "Oh, there was that one thing. He asked me the day before he died by suicide, 'Mom, do you think it's right music lyrics are being blamed for suicide?' You know, she just answered his question, but for the rest of her life, she'll wish she just sat down and said, 'Interesting you ask about that. Let's talk about this. If you ever had suicidal thoughts, would you know what to do?' So confronting these myths is absolutely essential.
And I can see from our survey there that we're kind of preaching to the choir. We have a lot of mental health folks and support staff on today, and a paucity of administrators. And there are times when schools can make decisions not to confront a suicide in the community because it didn't necessarily happen there yet. You know, Scott and I have consulted on so many deaths by suicide within the schools. You could have a ninth grader die by suicide and have very little impact at the high school, but yet the middle school is absolutely devastated. For every child that dies by suicide in the schools, you have 6 teachers at secondary level whose lives are potentially changed forever.
I think it's important that we compliment the administrators we do have on the session today, and we
Absolutely.
encourage the mental health professionals to share these slides. Look at the YRBS data in your state. Look at the mandates for suicide prevention that are in place in your state. And Rich is going to talk later about the importance of a suicide prevention task force. But let's look specifically at COVID-19.
Can I
You
just
know,
do one more myth? Hold on, Scott. I just want to do one more myth because it
sure.
is important. And that myth is that elementary school kids do not show suicidal or non-suicidal self-injurious behaviors. And I think everyone on this webinar who works in an elementary school is just shaking their heads because they know the truth. When I had a hotline to the schools with the LAUSD Suicide Prevention Unit in 25 years, we took close to 25,000 phone calls to our hotline, and half of those phone calls came from elementary schools. Also, suicide of a young person is rare. Suicide of a child below the age of 11 is extremely rare. But after 20 years, they did a study, and they found, when they looked at those 5 to 11-year-olds that died by suicide, that the African American boy was the highest risk, that their rates were consistently higher than white Native American youth. So I just wanted to confront one last myth, that elementary schools need to be part of district-wide planning. They need to be part of staff training. They need to be part of intervention and postvention activities.
And even the threat of a 4th grader needs to be taken seriously. Specifically with regards to suicide rates, the last national data, 2018, well before this pandemic, and it found the suicide rate in 2018 was the highest in 50 years. So I think we all have to acknowledge there's a kind of low-grade depression now for everyone. There have been so many societal issues, so much tension and consternation about our recent election. And sometimes I'm asked, Rich, who might be the most at risk in the age of this pandemic? And my thoughts are, did they have a previous mental illness? Did they lose a loved one of those 250,000 Americans that have died because of this pandemic? And I too lost a friend to the pandemic. And the third thing that we would look at would really be financial hardship. I'm afraid that more kids are living in poverty right now than in ever before. And then in our families, we've had increases in things like domestic violence, child abuse, substance abuse. And now I'll turn it back to you just to look at what kids missed out on.
Well, before I kind of go into some of the impact, let's just review. I just want to review about risk factors for youth suicide, because there is no one cause of a death by suicide. It generally is the coming together of as many as 8 different risk factors in a perfect storm. And with the impact of COVID-19, we see the components of the storm brewing that we're going to see impact over the next 18 months. Imagine these risk factors, these 8 risk factors in your community as 8 lights on your main street. For a kid to go from thinking about suicide to attempting suicide, all those lights have to turn green in a perfect storm. So the bad news is that if all those lights turn green for a child, they can go from thinking about suicide to attempting suicide in 4 minutes, particularly if the second light is green, and that is the possession of a firearm or access to a firearm sitting there on the table. If the firearm is not accessible, the kid, 1 out of 2 kids do not go on to another means. So you can save half the life there just by getting your firearms, because we're in isolation. So kids have been in isolation for months. The fears, especially for young kids, the uncertainty has created fear and anxiety. One study here in California had 44% of the respondents answering yes to questions that actually fit diagnosable level of depression and anxiety. So the isolation exacerbates the disconnectedness and makes it harder for us to connect and harder for kids to access mental health services. And kids have come into this with kind of pre-existing struggles with depression and anxiety, are at higher risk. So, and I also, just want to reinforce what Scott said about economic factors, that the last time we saw a tremendous increase was in 2008. When the country faced these economic stressors on families. So we're seeing just within the families increases in things like domestic violence, opioid use. Take it, Scott.
Well, one thing I think we could argue right now is the mental health needs of kids in America have never been greater. And it's a little frustrating that I'm really not aware of any efforts to increase social workers and school counselors and school psychologists, but we need to increase those personnel in our schools. And I'm really glad you mentioned lethal weapons. And I'm reminded of the Houston teenager who left the note behind for parents that said, "Why did you make this so easy? Why did you leave this gun available to me?" And we know when a kid attempts with the gun, they rarely get a second chance. And it's really important that school personnel talk with parents directly about, yes, your child talked about using a gun. Yes, he's convinced me he knows where it is. Yes, I do believe he knows how to load it. Mom and dad, secure that gun in your home. And of course, the parent often says, "I have the gun for safety." But can you foresee a time, mom and dad, when having that loaded and unlocked gun actually makes your house more unsafe? You hope they get it. If I got a mentally ill, depressed person in my home, it's really the responsible thing to do to lock up those guns. We have to have very difficult conversations with parents. And there's actually a training module at the Suicide Prevention Resource Center, the CALM training, that helps professionals become more comfortable, because taking away that means can make all the difference in the world. And state legislation. So I'm sitting here in Florida. We don't have it. Yes, a school in Florida could choose to become suicide prevention certified, but unfortunately, few schools choose that. California, on the other hand, has Assembly Bill 2246. Why don't you share the specifics of that bill with them?
Well, essentially, there are 2 kinds of legislation in America. Scott and I have written about this before. Those states, and I believe they're up to about 33 to 35 states that have the Jason Flatt Act. Jason Flatt Act from the Jason Foundation in Tennessee. Scott and I have partnered with them. This law mandates staff training every 2 years. However, Scott and I feel that staff training is just one part of a comprehensive suicide prevention program or a set of policies. We believe in a comprehensive suicide prevention program, which would include elements of prevention, intervention, and postvention. And the California law, which originally 2246 started out as only mandated for grades 7 through 12. Now, of course, under extraordinary response, they passed 1787 here in California, which now includes the K-5. So now suicide prevention policies will be for the entire spectrum of grades K through 12. And not only do we need prevention, intervention, postvention component, but we need to address the needs of high-risk groups. And among those high-risk groups are kids that are exposed to suicide, LGBT kids, kids who have mental illness, substance abuse problems, alcohol problems, or problems with depression and anxiety that we've talked about before. So all schools need a comprehensive plan here.
Absolutely. And again, I'd like to ask everybody listening to check and see what are the mandates and requirements in your particular state. And see, we believe that suicide prevention should not be site-based, with an individual administrator not finding the time for it. It really needs to come from the school board and from the superintendent, that this is what we will be doing district-wide. I think we'd also be remiss today not to talk about mental health of school staff right now. And I received a call yesterday. A rural school district here in Florida lost 2 employees to suicide in the last week. This is actually a time to talk about suicide prevention for all staff, not just what to look for to identify these warning signs in students, but in their colleagues as well. And the other thing I think is important is when you visit a school district website, and if you were to put in that search engine, youth suicide, teenage depression, something should come up. What are the warning signs? Where do I go for help? What are the national crisis resources? What are local crisis resources? And maybe most importantly, who do I contact at school? Because someone could be searching for themselves, their friend, their own kid. We need to have these resources front and center so everybody can find them.
Okay, so I have a suggestion, which every superintendent and every principal will love, but every assistant superintendent and assistant principal might yell at me for, and that is the need to create a suicide prevention task force inside your district. This task force would be available to advise the district on how to proceed, provide guidance to the superintendent and the district on how to upgrade with the new resources that come out every year, new best practices every year. Who should be on this task force? Well, it certainly should be a combination, a collaboration between administration, mental health personnel, community law enforcement, and school district law enforcement, as well as community mental health. One thing immediately that this task force can do is take a look at the policies and procedures to make sure. Scott and I are almost certain that the policies in most school districts comprise intervention only. And there are no written policies, and in a little bit we're going to talk about what are some of the suggestions we have for prevention, intervention, and postvention. But once you take a look at the policies and procedures, now look at them again and update them to the age of distance learning. How are we going to do virtual suicide prevention? There are emerging needs right now for the mental health professionals. How do we do our risk assessments virtually? And issues of consent, issues of, what do we do if many students don't have internet connections? What do we do for kids who have poor internet connections? What do we do for kids that have no privacy in their homes? We've all done Zoom meetings where there's a member that is behind a curtain, and we know that their entire family or their office is behind them carrying on, and they're in the one small corner of the home that they can do this. But this task force can update for telehealth and the consent procedures. You got a comment there, Scott? You usually kind of get that smile on your face when you're ready to say something.
Well, safety planning is incredibly important. And those safety plans, by the way, need to be written. And ideally, of course, we're sitting side by side with the student. We're asking them about what's got them through difficult times before. Internally, what can you do? Externally, what can you do? But if that student is sitting at home, we obviously have to be able to have an alternative way to contact them. We need to know if there's an adult in the home. How do we contact the adult? And that safety planning is going to be a little bit different over Zoom, for example. But you're the person that knows about apps. You want to tell them about My3 in particular and the Not Okay app?
There are a number of, as we have progressed, there's an app for just about everything, and there are wonderful apps for safety planning that are out there. Perhaps many of you, I'm sure many of the mental health folks that are online today have used some of these apps. The one I'm kind of on at the moment is my virtual hope box, because I love the word hope in there. It's so protective if we can just stimulate one of those 8 lights of risk is a sense of hopelessness. So we have also from the Jason Foundation, we have an app known When a Friend Asks, and My3, which was developed here in California with Proposition 63 funding. Proposition 63 here in California, the Mental Health Services Act. And if you're in any of the other 49 states, you should really look at how to get a law like this on the board. 1% of a millionaire's tax goes to mental health services in California. And suicide prevention works. When you take a look, California is ranked 45th in America for suicide rate, and LA has half the rate because they have been very proactive in suicide prevention. Suicide prevention works.
You know, I think one of the challenges we should talk about today is the role of the schools. It's really suicide screening, parent notification, referral for a comprehensive suicide assessment in the community. And I've heard you talk before about, unfortunately, a lot of information is hidden from personnel like counselors, social workers, and psychologists. It's like that community provider isn't really trying to coordinate with school personnel, and that's really unfortunate. And frankly, it's not unusual for a kid to be hospitalized and all of a sudden they're just back in class without a meeting. And maybe there was never even a written safety plan, even though they were hospitalized. I know these are the challenges that the people listening to are facing pretty routinely.
And Scott is talking about, like the essentials of the intervention component. Where collaboration and supervision of the student is paramount. Once we get back, and for those of you that are in brick and mortar settings at the moment, that supervision starts with the teacher. That's how critical teachers are to crisis teams. And they should be reassured that once they discover a suicidal child, that they have the steps right there on how to proceed. What do we want from teachers? We don't want teachers assessing kids for risk. We want teachers to recognize the risk factor warning sign, refer the student immediately, accompany the student or call the office to have the student escorted. Never send a student up to the office or to the school psychologist or counselor's or social worker's office or nurse's office for an assessment. You must maintain the chain of supervision. And then we always say the teacher should join the crisis team because they have incredible, valuable information. When a teacher just off the cuff says, this behavior is not like this child at all, that jumps out at us. So those are the roles for teachers. But for the mental health professionals are out there, right at the top now is getting training in risk assessment. And there are many ways to get training. That's one thing for a task force to realize. How are we going to train our mental health staff now, and not only to do face-to-face, but virtual suicide risk assessment? Scott's talked about the challenges of safety planning. And reentry planning, we usually spoke about in terms of a kid returning from hospitalization, but now it's kids returning to school, period. And how we cope with an at-risk student who has now been sent home for 2 weeks because of quarantining back in school. All of this is extraordinarily stressful for kids. I feel that schools are really struggling, you know, with these new applications in reaching every child. Imagine a teacher that's got, in a blended situation, they got 13 kids, you know, in front of them, 13 kids on the computer, and they got their own 2 kids at home. That's extraordinary stress. So I reinforce what Scott said before about let's reach out to staff. Let's find out who among staff is at risk, who is among staff has had losses. This is rare when Scott and I are quiet at the same exact time, but maybe we could say a word about postvention.
Well,
Absolutely.
I want to actually jump in and ask a question that has come up that I think would be great in this particular topic. And it comes from one of our attendees who's saying, we are struggling as a district with prevention education in the remote learning environment. A few expert departments, Forefront at UW, has advocated against suicide prevention education in the remote setting because of the lack of being able to reach students. I would love, you know, your thoughts on this.
Well, you know, I think ideally, suicide prevention education needs to take place in a group size no larger than a typical classroom. And the teacher really needs to be invested. Typically, this would be done by a school counselor. But the teacher can't leave the room or be in the back of the room grading papers. You really need a set of eyes on students. You need to get a read on how they're experiencing this information. That's what makes it so difficult remotely. We were both involved in a call with one program that's trying to figure out how to educate kids virtually on suicide prevention. We see some of the pitfalls and challenges, yet does it make sense now that we would just stop trying to get important information out to kids about how to help themselves and how to help their friends? A great challenge, and I'll turn it over to Rich for some comments.
Well, I agree. First, I think that students should be involved in suicide prevention within the districts. I kind of heard 2 questions there of I could certainly understand the fear in many communities of doing suicide prevention, with students in large groups over the internet. Scott and I wouldn't recommend that at all. As a matter of fact, even in brick and mortar schools, in the aftermath of a suicide, many times an administrator might think, well, I could get all my kids in an auditorium and do a suicide prevention program there where I can be sure to control the message that goes to them. But these meetings often do not turn out well for the majority of students. Imagine if you're a depressed kid in a very large group being talked, and you don't have the opportunity or the confidence to speak up when you're in a group of hundreds. So certainly suicide prevention, I could understand. Many districts are saying don't do risk assessments because we're having difficulty. I think that's why you need a task force with your district lawyer or attorneys on there to kind of advise you on how to proceed as far as consent, informed consent is. As far as training students, Scott and I both promote targeted training, that there are groups within the school, there are groups of peer counselors, there are groups of student government, and in many schools, they have gay-straight alliances, and GSA is an incredible group to help train and take the message among students out there.
There's also, and it started in Utah, Hope Squads, a student organization that provides a lot of support and a lot of intervention. Now, we do need to say a couple things about postvention, and you just brought it up, that we are both against an assembly after a suicide. And we got that written into the most recent toolkit from SPRC and AFSP. And a frustration I have is that given the scope of this problem, it's like schools need to download the after suicide toolkit. They need to look at it. They need to have a plan as opposed to be scrambling around trying to figure out what to do. And the first one of those toolkits, we helped with that in 2011. So we've actually had some pretty good guidance for schools now for 9 years. So there is a set of things to do, things to make sure you are not overreacting. But after a suicide occurs, unfortunately, it's now more on the minds of other young people. And the research is saying it's not necessarily the closest friends at all. It's just another kid with their own set of problems. They've been thinking about suicide for a long time. And what little research we have says postvention is often too short in duration and focuses on too few kids. We really need communities to think about postvention, not just for one school, but district wide. We could say when you have a suicide in a school community, right now I'm in Broward, sixth largest school district in the nation. They have a suicide. It's like throwing a rock into a pond. That ripple effect is everywhere. Now I've got an easy question for Rich. Why is the effect of a youth suicide greater today than ever before?
Well, let's see. It could be due to that newfangled thing they call that the Facebook. Do we talk maybe about social media? Could it be?
Yeah, I think that is absolutely correct. And how should schools use, what's your phrase? Social media broker. How should they use the student that way?
Yes, I see. I think that this person should be on the crisis team in the aftermath of a suicide. We kind of refer to kids as a cultural broker, someone that would help someone like me who still refers to it as the Facebook, kind of navigate through the various platforms of social media. See, now this is one of the blessings, this is one of the hidden opportunities of postvention, is that we can, if we monitor social media, we can find at-risk kids, and we can provide the safe messaging that's necessary to get through to these kids. So oftentimes kids are so struck with grief that they need some place to put it. They need a cause, right? The boyfriend-girlfriend breakup, a loss of a friend by suicide. It's their fault, or it's a lot more complex than that. And social media, as Scott and I have written, I'll turn it back over to him, has really been a kind of an effective source of contagion in America when putting out unsafe messages about suicide. What phrase do we want them to change now? We've been working with the media for 100 years.
Well, it's critical that the media stop making a suicide front page news. They shouldn't talk about method. They should never report it as being unexplainable or simplistic. The media needs to focus on what to look for and what to do to prevent further suicides, and suicides are preventable. But was there another point you wanted to make about media?
Well, the last point is that when we and everybody here that's with us today, we have hundreds of participants. We want everybody, please, starting today, to no longer use the term committed suicide. The term you'll find in newspapers slowly changing in today's world, but the media has been pretty committed to using this term. Committed suicide really does not provide comfort to survivors of suicide, as if my loved one committed some crime or violated some moral code. The appropriate phrase would be died by suicide, and Scott and I would hope that all of us today would use that expression from here on in.
Yes, and we should never put the word successful with our topic today. And when I read about another youth suicide, I actually think of it pretty simply. Untreated or undertreated mental illness, probably in combination with adverse childhood experiences. And Cognito has an excellent resource about coping with loss. Do we have that on a slide?
Maybe Maria can tell us a little bit about it.
I'd be happy to. I want to, before I do that, I have one more question that I want to ask you that is coming up a lot in relationship to remote learning and virtual learning. Do you have any best practices to share in doing suicide risk assessment virtually and dealing with virtual issues? Anything that you've encountered or can share on that topic?
Well,
Well, I
absolutely.
want to take a moment and applaud Rich for all the work he's done with NAS. Please tell him about that.
Thanks, Scott. Yes, these questions have come up, as soon as America went into stay at home in January and February. So I worked with a cadre of school psychologists, and we wrote an article on preparing and conducting suicide risk assessments. And it's a lot to go through for today with the time that we have it. So I just advise you to go to the National Association of School Psychologists website and avail yourselves of their COVID-19 resources. Extraordinary resources, not only for suicide assessment, but for threat assessment, care for the caregiver, and Scott has written extensively about coping with grief in the classroom, and Cognito's resources.
Yeah, so with that, I'll share, and we'll turn it over to questions. I'll share a little bit about the work that we've done with Scott and Rich, really in response to a loss, right? And right now, due to COVID and the side effects of COVID beyond just the deaths that are resulting from the illness, is that unfortunately many districts don't have access to experts like Scott and Rich to come and help respond to a death within the school. So we partnered together to prepare a tool that administrators, teachers, and other school staff can use to respond to a death with care. And this Resilient Together virtual simulation really allows your educators and your staff to understand the extra considerations for postvention when dealing with a death by suicide, to understand how to take the next steps to establish a crisis response plan, which includes identifying a crisis response team, communicating clear and universal expectations, and collaborating with your community mental health services to prepare a plan. It also focuses on supporting students impacted by a death by spotting signs of distress, affirming and normalizing their emotions, and connecting them with support, and really offering a safe environment where the administrators, the educators can go in and really practice these scenarios, practice how to respond to supporting a colleague who's dealing with the loss, as well as a student. So it is important to offer a wide range of resources in response to a death, but also as part of prevention. I would turn it over to you both to really talking about prevention as part of postvention, correct?
Well, absolutely, because what we're trying to do is to help everybody with their shock, their confusion, their grief, and yes, sometimes even guilt. We're trying to prevent further tragedies by really supporting all those people that have lost a classmate, lost a colleague, or somebody who's lost a parent, regardless of the cause of death. But it gets obviously more complicated when the loss was to suicide. I think it was Schneidman that said something like this: you lose a loved one to suicide, it's the most complicated grief there is. It's like they left their skeleton in your closet. And this module we believe will greatly help schools at this difficult time. Right now, I have 2 students working on their doctoral project. Why? They lost siblings when they were in school, and basically there was like no response. It's like everybody pretended that somebody's brother didn't die. So it's really critical that schools are unfortunately going to deal with deaths of staff and students, sadly, somewhat routinely, and they need to have plans. And to do this in a caring way. And in our society, too often somebody just says, I understand. Really, you don't understand unless something like that happened to you. And it's really all about listening and being empathetic and knowing resources.
And I'll add, that was eloquent, and I don't have much to add to that. But I'll give you one practical suggestion for your task forces, and that now in a prevention mode, establish a memorial policy by which you are going to acknowledge all student deaths the same way. This way, you will never have to deal with why you planted a tree last year for a student who died from cancer, but yet I'm asking you to plant a tree for my child and you're telling me that's not appropriate. One memorial policy will settle the issue as to how schools will acknowledge. It's very important. Scott, described 2 very painful circumstances for siblings when the schools do not provide an opportunity. I mean, just culturally, across all cultures, grieving and mourning and memorializing your lost one is an intensely personal tradition and ritual, and must be upheld, by the schools. And we must allow students and once again, everybody download the After a Suicide Toolkit for schools today, so that they have a great section on memorials, on creative ways to memorialize death. Maybe, Scott, you can give one right off the bat.
Well, I think one thing that is really important is that most prevention in this country is really driven by survivors. And we like what are called living memorials. Raising money, raising awareness. Let's try to make sure this never happens to somebody else. That's really our favorite, not something permanent like, a big granite memorial, but let's raise awareness. Let's put the money to use in ways that will prevent tragedies. But you are absolutely right about cause of death should not matter, but popularity should not matter. Socioeconomic should not matter. We need a policy. This is what we do, not just at one school, but for the entire district, because this creates problems. When one high school really went a little overboard, and now a school 4 miles away doesn't do something quite as dramatic. But this is where that planning, resources, task force, we should be able to anticipate and be ready to deal with some of these things.
And to contribute to a suicide prevention effort in your community. Oh, I see we're up to the Q&A slide.
We have lots of questions coming in. You're welcome to finish your thought. I just again want to invite all of our attendees to continue to submit questions, and we'll try to answer as many of them. So Rich, do you want to close that thought out before we transition, or should we dive in?
Nope, we're good.
Beautiful. So one of the first questions I'd like to ask is, do you know of any suicide prevention school training programs that jointly address children, adolescents, and parents during these COVID-19 times? I am still relatively new to learning about suicide, but I wonder if this could be an effective way of providing information in a distance online setting and still providing kids with some in-person support. Do you have any thoughts on that? And Scott, or would you like to start us off?
Well, one of the things that, and to put in a plug for my university, NSU, Florida, we have a lot of recordings that are part of Shark chats. I think we have nearly 50 of them, and many of them are dealing with COVID-19. They're dealing with suicide prevention and a lot of other challenges that all of our schools and communities are going through. And that's nova.edu/shark chats. But I think, to be honest, Maria, everybody is just trying to figure all this out in terms of, I can't really direct anybody to a specific program that really outlines everything about suicide prevention in the age of COVID-19. And a lot of it is our title today, doubling down, making sure maybe your district wasn't even doing all these things before. If not, they need them now. If you had a lot of things in place, let's look at it again. Let's make sure we're really doing it. And what else do we need to add?
Suicide, what comes up for me, a couple of things. Suicide prevention in schools really fits into your multi-tiered system of support, MTSS. Okay, I mean, it used to be a triangle. Everything used to be a triangle, you know, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 kinds of responses in the schools. Now I found out after presenting with an instructor in PBIS that it's no longer a triangle, it's a bookcase. But as you can see, suicide prevention would fit wonderfully in there, where you have universal kinds of approaches, such as the training of teachers, the training of crisis team members, as well as the training of parents in the warning sign, risk factors and warning signs, and what their role is. See, what I learned in 25 years at LAUSD is you don't tell people what it's not necessary for them to do. In other words, suicide risk assessment should be done by mental health folks. Suicide identification and training should be done by staff and parents. And what we've done here, now once you identify, you need an intervention component, which is a tier 2 intervention. And then if a student remains at high risk, a tier 3 intervention, which a small amount of kids who are who continue to be traumatized or at the impact of ACEs would receive extensive individual therapy like cognitive behavioral therapies and dialectical behavior therapies. Postvention involves all 3 tiers. So what we've done here in LA County is we've provided 3 curriculum. It's called the SPORT program for training crisis teams, training parents, and training school staff. And we reached out to each of the school districts, 80 school districts in LA County. They each sent a 4-member team that we immediately turned into their district prevention task force. We trained them on how to go out and train others, and within an 8-month period of time, 22,000, staff were trained across LA County. So there are a number of creative ways that you can go.
What else do you have there for us, Maria?
Yeah, so the next question, this is more of a comment, but again, would love your any additional suggestions for this person. In districts with remote learning, where for privacy reasons, students do not have to show their faces, it is difficult for teachers to know how students are actually feeling doing outside of a wellness check-in during class. Any suggestions for how to get around that?
Wow, that's a great question. And actually, I'm going to be honest, when I teach my classes online, I basically tell students, I want your camera on. I know there may be times when it needs to be turned off because if something's going on in your home, but I think we need to be able to see the faces of our students the majority of time. So I'm not quite sure where this thought is coming from that we can't see students' faces. I'm afraid that is going to make it very difficult to read emotionally what's going on, but I can't imagine that they're paying attention and learning very much as well.
Well, I'd agree with that. This is one of the many challenges of, doing things virtually with kids leaving ADHD kids sitting in one seat doing, virtual learning, really difficult, for them. I think one of the things that teachers need to be aware of even before they go online is all the information that they need for every individual child, and have it in redundant ways, not only the address, but the parents' phone numbers, parents' cell phone numbers, things like that. So we always have to know where the child is and if there is supervision on the site. And one thing that you can do in a prevention phase is have that task force meet and determine when is it appropriate and how do we go about doing a wellness check. Okay, so that the appropriate people, many school districts, Scott and I have taken calls on this, all from districts that have a law enforcement arm, the larger school districts, like LAUSD has Los Angeles School Police, to school resource officers who are critical parts of both suicide and threat assessment teams, and local law enforcement is who, when is your fear warranted to just go out to follow up with either calls or to actually send someone out to the house.
I also want to
Thank you
say
so, yeah.
one other point about, when we have student online virtually. I remember a call from last spring. Well, the student died by suicide. The principal doesn't even want to make a phone call to the home. See, I'm not thinking just a phone call to the home. I'm thinking mask up and go out. Maybe we stay on the porch, but we reach out to those surviving siblings. And when we got an extreme crisis with the student, I don't think there's anything to stop a couple of people from either going to the home or mom and dad and the child mask up and come to school. I mean, when we've got an emergency situation, I think we need to try to respond physically as much as possible and just follow reasonable safety guidelines.
Thank you so much. The last question I'll ask, just because we are out of time, is a lot of people wanted to know, Rich, can you repeat the name of the LA program you mentioned earlier?
We have the sport program, and if you just go on to the LA County Office of Education, laco.edu, the website, punch in sport. You will get the Center for Distance and Online Learning. Take a look at all the resources that we have online for the center. You can always write the center for more personal kinds of concerns. Be happy to get back to you.
Thank you so much. And I think what we'll do, because there were a lot of questions about resources you mentioned, is that we will compile resources and apps that were mentioned by Scott and Rich today and include that in the follow-up email so that you all have access to it. But otherwise, I want to thank our audience for joining us for the last hour. And I want to invite Scott and Rich, any last words that you can say to our audience as they continue to support our students through this very unprecedented time.
Well, Maria, I'd like to emphasize suicide prevention is everyone's responsibility. And I'd really encourage you to try to form a district task force. And I know without a doubt, many of you have already done extraordinary things to make a difference. And I know you've prevented youth suicides. But this is a time when we all need to work together and try harder.
And I would just like to underscore, first of all, thank you for the opportunity today. Always great to work with my buddy. And I appreciate the opportunity to end on a sense of hope. While there are many challenges to virtual suicide prevention, there are many opportunities as well. I just want to reinforce, while some suicides can't be prevented to the tune of almost 50,000 Americans, most can. And everybody will play a role in that. And we should realize that kids are resilient and they can get better. Thanks again.
Rich, life is a struggle right now, but we will get through this. There will be a future.
Absolutely. Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Rich, for your time and for sharing with us for the last hour. It is always a pleasure to have you here with us. Take care, everyone. Stay safe, and we'll see you on the next Cognito webinar.